north of Baffin Island. And suddenly they find an icebreaker door crashing through to get to a, I don't know, mining camp or something. And they can't cross. So, and nor can the caribou. So the environment in these parts of the world is being dramatically affected by big business expansion. Now, at one point we went on a long kayaking journey, and we stopped in a small community called Umimatok, and that is at the head of the Bathurst Inlet in Canada. And this puts, you know, the idea that people are inherently selfish and covetous and everything else is a complete nonsense in my view. We turned up in the middle of the night, freezing cold, and there's Steve, my companion, and myself. And this community was basically these people. There weren't any more people living in this very small Inuit community. And they turned out in the middle of the night. It was dark, cold and wet. And they welcomed into their houses. They all came to life and they gave us bannock and caribou to eat and coffee. And we had a fantastic time with them. Now, this, I believe, shows that people are inherently kind. They're thoughtful. They look after their fellow human beings. They are not, as a lot of politicians I suspect would have us believe, inherently covetous, nasty, want to grab everything you've got. People I do not believe are like that. And I think it's a very useful tool for certain politicians to use to suggest they are, because all the time you believe they are, you'll want to hang on to this stuff and keep running this system. But if you can believe that humans are inherently kind, you move on a step. Now, there's a further point to be made here. Because this is a small community, it is not considered by the Canadian government to be economically viable. This lady had certain medical needs. Now that meant that they occasionally had to fly a helicopter in to take her to hospital to look after her. Now, they didn't want to do that anymore, so they're almost forcing the closure of this community and forcing these people to move somewhere else. Because if they're near a bigger town, you know, it's cheaper for them to deal with the medical requirements of the elderly people. But they will absolutely have no problem flying this stuff around. And they fly this all over the Arctic. And now what is this? It's crap, basically. And that is sugary water. That is all that is. Very, very heavy sugary water. That pallet probably weighs 5 times that old lady that you saw in that previous slide, at least. Okay? Now the other thing is, it's a known fact in the Arctic that children's teeth are rotting and their health is going to pot. But they continue to sell them this stuff, particularly that. And it's ruining their teeth, because these are children that come from the culture of meat eating. They're not used to this rubbish, and they've been fed it over the last 20 or 30 years, if that. And of course these companies make a fortune out of selling it, because the poor children, bless them, are addicted now to the sugar and the fats and the salts that are contained in here. And you can see their health suffering. I've seen it. And on the subject of children up in this part of the world, the Arctic is not this sort of wonderful Nanook of the North smiling Eskimo scenario, I'm afraid. It's nothing like that at all. And I stayed with a teacher north of Pond Inlet, and while I was talking to this teacher, I said, well, you know, how many children do you have in your class? It's a very small town, tiny town. And he said, I have 30. And I used to teach at one time, and I said, crikey, that's a big class, 30. He said, yeah, but they're never 30 there, because, you know, they're all out sort of sniffing glue, getting drunk, or whatever they're doing. And I said, so how many do you have there? So, well, 10 if I'm lucky, and most of it's 5 regulars. So at that point, the teaching sounded easier. But, you know, the fact is, he also told me that in 1 year, 8 children in a very small community committed suicide. So that is what we're driving these young people towards at the moment. Now, the environment is something I think people and society, not people, I must avoid that, society is, through no fault of its own, because of our system, is losing, the environment is losing touch with society, or society is losing touch with the environment. I took this near my house, and I have to say, something like this is, obviously, as you know, it's honeysuckle. It's so pleasurable to sort of walk past something like that and smell it. You don't need to, you know, it's not like you need to buy it. It's there in the hedgerow for you to enjoy. And I feel quite sad that we're almost, as a society, being encouraged away from this. Now, years ago, in the early 60s, There was a lady that some of you probably have heard of, and she was around at the time that this book came out by Eliot, and in that book you've got countless pages of chemicals that you can use to treat weeds in your garden. And that was the sort of time when that was considered okay. But also at that time, 62 I think it was, Rachel Carson wrote the seminal Silent Spring book. Sadly, she died of cancer. But she was basically exposing these big chemical companies that made vast profits out of spraying the American highways and getting rid of weeds left, right and centre. Not realising that all this stuff that grows on the side of America's highways, or indeed any highway, is wonderful for wildlife and all the things that we know it for. So the point I'm making, I suppose, here is that that problem existed then. Monsanto, huge company, tried to destroy this woman. They absolutely pulled out all the stocks and tried to literally destroy her. But because her science was so good, she put up a hell of a fight, and she did actually win through and get some controls over some of the chemicals that we used. Even in my own company, my own tree company, until recently, we used to use a chemical called sodium sulfamate for killing stumps. And our guys used to go out and drill holes and put this stuff in. And invariably they threw up or came back sick. And if you got so much of a grain on this stuff on your hands, you would feel as sick as a dog. Anside was the trade name for it, and now it's been banned. Which is good, but I'm sure they're still trying to find another chemical that they can sell. Right, this is another Arctic picture, I'm afraid, but this is, David mentioned canoeing the Mackenzie River, and this was near the end of the Mackenzie River, and I always take pictures of trees when I see them. And I spoke to some First Nation people living near here, and there was a very interesting conflict. They're about to put a pipeline down the Mackenzie River, which means the destruction of lots of hunting and trapping lines, and indeed the entire change of the way people live here. A very interesting conflict of opinions. What you find is some of them will say, great, it's great because it's going to bring jobs, lift the economy, more jobs, more money, and they saw that as good. And others, 50% of them, were totally against it because they saw it as being the end of their culture and the end of the way they had always lived. Now, this picture is not, some horrible place in, I don't know, in Europe or somewhere. This is Greenland. And as a result of packaging, which is something that you're all very familiar with, we are constantly made to buy one avocado over another by having 6 or 7 different types of packaging on it to try and make it look more appealing. That packaging is not to protect the fruit. Whenever you see packaging, it's got nothing to do with what's inside, other than to try and make you buy it. But the end result of this plastic that's being produced by society is it generally ends up somewhere else. And I remember when I did chemistry at school, my chemistry teacher said, "This is great, this plastic," and he showed us how to make it. He said, "The problem is you never get rid of it." And of course, we now know that in the Pacific, there's an area the size of Texas, 2 or 3 meters deep of solid plastic at the moment in the big Pacific eddy. And there's 146,000 pieces of plastic in every square mile of the world's oceans. And I've kayaked thousands of miles around Greenland and the Arctic, and I've often haven't seen it, you see it all down the edges, but not always on water. So if you think, well, that can't be true, it's not on water, I mean in the water, it exists in the water. So, I put this in just because I thought it was quite amusing. I mean, talking about packaging, trying to sell you things. Near where I live, there's a huge, great shopping extravaganza called Blue Water.